The emergency sirens screamed across Montana Wildlife Sanctuary as 72-year-old William "Bill" Thompson gripped his wheelchair armrests, watching an 800-pound Kodiak Grizzly hybrid charge directly toward him through the panicking crowd. Security guards shouted through megaphones for everyone to evacuate immediately, their voices cracking with terror as families scattered like leaves in a hurricane, abandoning strollers and picnic blankets in their desperate flight to safety. But this wasn't a rampage, it was a reunion. Children's screams pierced the Montana air as parents swept them into their arms, stumbling over abandoned belongings while the massive bear moved with singular purpose past fleeing visitors, ignoring easier prey to focus solely on the elderly man who couldn't run even if he wanted to. The sanctuary's head of security, Sarah Martinez, raised her tranquilizer rifle with trembling hands, her 20 years of experience telling her to shoot. But something in the bear's deliberate approach made her hesitate. Bill slowly removed his oxygen mask despite his labored breathing, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as recognition flooded his failing heart. "Hello, son," he whispered to the approaching giant, his voice barely audible above the chaos, yet somehow reaching the creature that had been searching for him. What happened next would challenge everything the world thought it knew about love transcending species and time itself. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. William "Bill" Thompson had never imagined his life would end up measured in trailer park lot fees and pill bottles. At 72, the retired railroad welder from Billings found himself counting pennies like a man half his age counting dreams. His weathered hands, once steady enough to weld steel tracks that carried freight across Montana, now trembled as he sorted his monthly medications on the cramped kitchen table of his double-wide trailer in Sunset Meadows Mobile Home Park. The Social Security check of $847 arrived like clockwork each month, but it disappeared just as predictably. Lot rent took $350, leaving him to choose between his heart medication at $340 or eating more than peanut butter sandwiches for dinner. Last month, he'd sold Martha's wedding ring to pay for groceries, the simple gold band that had circled her finger for 48 years now converted into 2 weeks of canned soup and crackers. "I'm older than dirt and twice as dusty," he'd tell the stray cats he fed behind his trailer each morning at 6, the only creatures that seemed to appreciate his company these days. His son Jake had moved to Seattle 5 years ago, calling maybe twice a year if Bill was lucky. Their last conversation had been stilted, filled with the kind of careful politeness reserved for distant relatives and bill collectors. The stroke 18 months ago had stolen his mobility, confining him to a wheelchair and making him dependent on an oxygen tank that wheezed like an old dog. The doctors at Billings General had delivered his latest diagnosis with the bedside manner of a tax collector: congestive heart failure, 2 to 4 weeks if he was lucky. They'd offered expensive treatments he couldn't afford, then shrugged when he declined, as if 72-year-old railroad workers were as disposable as yesterday's newspaper. But Bill had found something worth living for at the Montana Wildlife Sanctuary, 40 minutes away on his mobility scooter. 3 months ago, desperate for human contact that didn't involve medical bills or eviction notices, he'd volunteered to help with feeding schedules. That's where he'd met Dr. Rebecca Stone, the sanctuary director who carried herself with the quiet competence of someone accustomed to fixing broken things. And that's where he'd found Buddy. The 800-pound Kodiak Grizzly hybrid had been deemed aggressive and unpredictable by every facility that had housed him since he was found orphaned at 6 weeks old. Other volunteers avoided his enclosure, but Bill felt drawn to the massive creature who paced his concrete domain with the restless energy of someone who understood abandonment. Their first meeting had been simple enough. Bill had wheeled his chair close to the fence, close enough to see the intelligence in those dark eyes, and started talking about Martha, about Jake, about the loneliness that filled his trailer like stale air. Buddy had stopped pacing, tilted his massive head, and listened with the attention Bill's own son had never given him. "You and me, we're both just waiting for someone to come home, aren't we, boy?" The first time Bill Thompson wheeled his chair up to Buddy's enclosure, the other volunteers had backed away nervously. The massive bear had earned a reputation for aggressive displays whenever humans approached, snarling, charging the fence, and once even bending the steel bars with his enormous paws. But when Bill positioned his wheelchair at the feeding station and began talking in his gravelly Montana drawl, something extraordinary happened. Buddy stopped pacing. "Well, hello there, big fella," Bill had said, his voice carrying the same gentle tone he'd once used with frightened horses during his younger days working cattle ranches. "I heard you don't much care for company, but I figured maybe you just hadn't met the right person yet." The bear approached the fence cautiously, his massive frame moving with surprising grace. Instead of the usual aggressive posturing, Buddy sat down heavily and tilted his head, studying this weathered old man who showed no fear. For 20 minutes, Bill talked about everything and nothing: Martha's flower garden, the way morning coffee tasted better when shared, the loneliness that echoed through his trailer at night. When feeding time came, Buddy did something that shocked even Dr. Rebecca Stone, who had been observing from a distance. The bear, who typically devoured his meals in aggressive isolation, waited. He looked at Bill, then at the food, then back at Bill as if asking permission. "Go ahead, son," Bill whispered. "It's okay." Only then did Buddy begin to eat. Dr. Rebecca Stone found herself studying this unlikely pair with growing fascination. At 43, she had dedicated her career to wildlife rehabilitation, but she had never witnessed such an immediate bond between a human and one of the sanctuary's most troubled residents. What she hadn't told anyone was that her interest in Bill Thompson went far beyond professional curiosity. 2 years ago, after hiring a private investigator and spending most of her savings, Rebecca had discovered the identity of her birth father. The adoption papers had been sealed for 47 years, but money and persistence had eventually revealed the truth. William Thompson, railroad worker from Billings, Montana, had searched for his daughter until his wife Martha became too sick to continue the quest. Now, watching him form this connection with Buddy, Rebecca struggled with emotions she'd buried for decades. Part of her wanted to reveal herself immediately, to bridge the gap that time and circumstance had created. But another part feared rejection, worried that the father who had given her up might not want her back in his life. Every day, Bill's routine became more established. He would arrive at exactly 2 o'clock, parking his wheelchair beside Buddy's enclosure. He brought Martha's old boombox, playing country music from the 1960s while he shared stories about his life. Buddy would lie down near the fence, his massive head resting on his paws, listening with an attention that Bill's own family had rarely shown. "Martha would have loved you," Bill told the bear one afternoon, his voice thick with emotion. "She always said I had a way with animals. But I think she was wrong. I had a way with the lost ones, the ones nobody else wanted to understand." The transformation in Buddy was remarkable. The aggressive displays stopped entirely. He began eating regularly, gained weight, and showed interest in his environment for the first time since arriving at the sanctuary. Dr. Stone documented everything, knowing she was witnessing something that challenged conventional understanding of animal behavior. But Bill's health was deteriorating. The daily trips to the sanctuary exhausted him, yet he refused to miss a single visit. Rebecca began paying his medical bills anonymously, channeling money through the sanctuary's charity fund. She watched him struggle with his medication costs, witnessed him rationing his oxygen to make the tanks last longer, and felt her heart break for the father she'd never known. The crisis came on a Thursday afternoon in early October. Bill collapsed beside Buddy's enclosure, his heart struggling against the combination of excitement and exertion. Rebecca rushed to his side, her medical training taking over as she checked his vitals while calling for an ambulance. Buddy's reaction was unprecedented. The bear pressed against the fence, vocalizing in low, distressed tones that sounded almost like whimpering. When the paramedics arrived and began loading Bill onto a stretcher, Buddy became agitated, pacing frantically along the fence line. "Don't let them hurt my boy," Bill whispered to Rebecca as the paramedics prepared to transport him. "Promise me you'll take care of him if something happens to me." "I promise," Rebecca replied, her voice breaking as she squeezed his weathered hand. At Billings General Hospital, the diagnosis was severe, advanced congestive heart failure. The cardiologist explained that Bill needed immediate surgery, but the cost would exceed $60,000. Bill's Medicare wouldn't cover the experimental procedure, and he had no family to help with expenses. What the doctor didn't know was that Bill did have family. Rebecca Stone sat in the waiting room, staring at adoption papers she'd carried for 2 years, finally understanding that some bonds transcend biology, while others require courage to acknowledge. Marcus Blackwood stood in his corner office on the 32nd floor of Blackstone Tower in Denver, staring at the surveillance photos spread across his mahogany desk. The images showed an elderly man in a wheelchair beside a bear enclosure, but to Marcus, they represented something far more valuable than a heartwarming human interest story. They represented $15 million in development potential and the final piece of his personal vendetta against the creatures that had destroyed his childhood. At 55, Marcus had built Blackstone Industries into a billion-dollar empire through careful manipulation and ruthless business practices. Hotels, casinos, shopping centers, he transformed natural landscapes into profit centers with surgical precision. But the Montana Wildlife Sanctuary represented more than just another development opportunity. It was personal. The nightmares still came 47 years after that camping trip in Glacier National Park. Marcus had been 8 years old, watching his father set up their tent beside a crystal-clear stream when the grizzly bear emerged from the tree line. The attack lasted less than 3 minutes, but those moments had defined every day of Marcus's life since. His father's screams, the sound of claws on flesh, the blood that turned the mountain stream red, memories that therapy couldn't erase and money couldn't silence. "Mr. Blackwood?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Tommy Rodriguez is here to see you." Tommy Rodriguez stepped into the office with the nervous energy of a man carrying too much weight on his shoulders. At 34, the sanctuary's maintenance supervisor had worked with animals his entire adult life, but his 8-year-old daughter's leukemia diagnosis had created a financial crisis that his modest salary couldn't address. The experimental treatment she needed would cost $47,000, and insurance had already denied the claim twice. "Sit down, Tommy," Marcus said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a predator putting prey at ease. "I understand you're dealing with some difficult circumstances." Tommy remained standing, his calloused hands clenched at his sides. "Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate you wanting to help, but I can't do what you're asking. That bear, Buddy, he's not dangerous. He's actually gentle, especially with Bill Thompson. What you're suggesting could get people hurt." Marcus moved around his desk, studying the younger man with calculating eyes. "Tommy, let me be very clear about something. Your daughter has maybe 2 months before her condition becomes untreatable. The sanctuary is going to close regardless. We have the legal authority to condemn the property for public safety concerns. The only question is whether you walk away with enough money to save your little girl's life. But sabotaging the enclosure locks will create a minor safety incident that forces the sanctuary to relocate their animals to more appropriate facilities," Marcus interrupted. "No one gets hurt, The animals find better homes and you get $50,000, more than enough for your daughter's treatment." Tommy's shoulders sagged under the weight of impossible choices. He thought about Isabella lying in that hospital bed, her once bright eyes dulled by chemotherapy, asking why Daddy couldn't make her better. The doctors had been clear. Without the experimental treatment, she had maybe 6 months to live. "The bear won't hurt anyone," Tommy said quietly, trying to convince himself as much as Marcus. "Buddy's been at the sanctuary for 8 years. He knows the layout, knows the staff. He'll probably just wander around confused until we can guide him back to his enclosure." Marcus nodded, sensing victory. "Exactly. A minor incident, quickly resolved. The media will focus on the safety concerns. The state will have grounds to condemn the property, and everyone benefits. Except instead of a slow closure that traumatizes the animals over months, we create a situation that forces quick, humane relocations." What Marcus didn't mention was the team of marksmen he'd already positioned around the sanctuary's perimeter, or the contingency plan that would ensure Buddy never made it to another facility alive. Some vendettas required patience, but others demanded blood. Meanwhile, Dr. Rebecca Stone was conducting her own investigation into the unusual activity she'd noticed around the sanctuary. Security cameras had been mysteriously malfunctioning in specific areas, always near the larger predator enclosures. Maintenance requests were being filed for equipment that didn't need repair. Most troubling, several staff members had reported seeing unfamiliar men in expensive suits asking questions about liability protocols and emergency procedures. Her research into Blackstone Industries had revealed a pattern of acquisitions that always seemed to follow safety incidents at wildlife facilities. 3 sanctuaries in Colorado, 2 in Wyoming, 1 in Idaho, all closed after animals escaped under mysterious circumstances, all subsequently purchased by Blackstone subsidiaries for development projects. "Sarah," Rebecca called to her head of security, "I need you to run background checks on any new maintenance requests from the past month. Something's not right." Sarah Martinez had been with the sanctuary for 15 years, long enough to recognize the signs of corporate interference. "Doc, I've been thinking the same thing. Yesterday I caught 2 men photographing our emergency protocols. When I approached them, they claimed to be insurance investigators, but their credentials didn't check out." Rebecca felt a chill of premonition. "What's our most vulnerable enclosure?" "Buddy's, without question. The electronic locks are computerized, which makes them hackable if someone has the right equipment. And with Bill's condition getting worse, Buddy's been more agitated lately. If something happened to separate them..." "We need to contact the authorities," Rebecca decided. "If Blackstone is planning what I think they're planning, Bill and Buddy are both in danger." But even as she reached for her phone, Rebecca knew they were running out of time. Tommy Rodriguez was scheduled to work the next day, and his daughter's medical bills were accumulating faster than his conscience could resist Marcus Blackwood's offer. In his hospital bed at Billings General, Bill Thompson stared at the ceiling tiles and worried about Buddy. The bear hadn't eaten since Bill's collapse 3 days ago, and the sanctuary staff was growing concerned. Rebecca had visited twice, updating him on Buddy's condition. But something in her eyes suggested she wasn't telling him everything. "That boy's waiting for me to come home," Bill whispered to the empty room. "Just like I waited for Jake all these years. Difference is, Buddy won't give up on me." The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd finally found the family loyalty he'd always craved, only to discover it in a creature that couldn't even speak his language. Or could it? Tuesday morning dawned crisp and clear across the Montana Wildlife Sanctuary, the kind of perfect autumn day that drew families from across the state for what many considered their last outdoor adventure before winter settled in. By 10 o'clock, Nearly 500 visitors had already passed through the entrance gates, including 3 elementary school groups on field trips and a busload of senior citizens from the Billings Community Center. Bill Thompson arrived at his usual time, 2 o'clock sharp, though the effort of making the 40-minute drive in his modified pickup truck had left him more exhausted than usual. His oxygen tank wheezed steadily beside his wheelchair as he positioned himself at Buddy's enclosure, noting immediately that something was different about his friend's behavior. Buddy paced restlessly along the fence line, his massive frame tense with an anxiety that Bill had never witnessed before. The bear's usual calm demeanor had been replaced by constant movement, low vocalizations that sounded almost like whimpering, and an inability to settle in their customary spot beside the fence where Bill would read to him from Martha's old romance novels. "What's got you spooked, boy?" Bill asked, his weathered hand reaching through the bars to stroke Buddy's fur. "You're acting like there's a storm coming, but the sky's clear as a bell." Nearby, a group of school children pressed against the viewing area, their teacher explaining the difference between grizzly bears and black bears. "This particular bear is actually a hybrid," the young woman was saying, reading from her guidebook. "Part Kodiak, part grizzly, which makes him larger and more intelligent than typical bears. He's been here for 8 years and has never shown any aggressive behavior toward humans." Bill smiled at the teacher's description, remembering his first conversation with Dr. Rebecca Stone about Buddy's unusual intelligence. "Smarter than most people I know," he'd told her, and she'd agreed with a knowing look that suggested she understood exactly what he meant. Dr. Rebecca Stone was having her own difficult morning, torn between her duties as sanctuary director and her growing certainty that disaster was approaching. Her investigation into Blackstone Industries had revealed Marcus Blackwood's traumatic childhood and his systematic targeting of wildlife facilities across the western states. More disturbing, her contacts at the FBI had confirmed that several previous accidents at other sanctuaries showed signs of deliberate sabotage. She stood in her office, staring at the adoption papers she'd carried for 2 years, knowing that today might be her last opportunity to tell Bill Thompson the truth about her identity. But every time she approached the subject, fear held her back. What if he rejected her? What if learning about a daughter he'd never known only added to his suffering during his final weeks of life? "Dr. Stone?" Sarah Martinez knocked on the open door, her face grim with concern. "We have a problem. I just discovered that someone accessed our computer system last night. They downloaded the electronic lock protocols for all the large predator enclosures." Rebecca's heart sank. "Tommy Rodriguez?" "His access code was used, but the timing doesn't match his usual patterns. Either someone forced him to cooperate, or they're using his credentials without his knowledge." Across the sanctuary, Tommy Rodriguez was indeed facing the most difficult decision of his life. He stood in the maintenance shed, holding the electronic device that Marcus Blackwood had provided, knowing that activating it would disable the security locks on Buddy's enclosure. His hands shook as he thought about Isabella in her hospital bed, asking him last night if the doctors were going to make her better. "Daddy, why do I have to be sick?" she'd whispered, her small hand barely visible beneath the IV tubes. "Did I do something wrong?" The experimental treatment would begin next week if he could pay for it. Without the treatment, the doctors had given her 2 months, maybe 3 if they were lucky. $50,000 for his daughter's life seemed like a bargain, but the price of betraying Buddy and Bill felt immeasurable. His phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus Blackwood. 3:45 p.m. No delays. Your daughter's life depends on your decision. Meanwhile, Marcus Blackwood had arrived at the sanctuary with his team of 6 men, all dressed in suits and carrying identification that claimed they were state safety inspectors. His carefully orchestrated plan was proceeding exactly as designed. Maximum visitor attendance to create chaos, media contacts already alerted about potential safety concerns, and backup teams positioned around the perimeter with tranquilizer guns and high-powered rifles. "Remember," he told his team through their earpieces, "this needs to look like a tragic accident. An elderly man in a wheelchair couldn't escape from a dangerous animal that should never have been kept in captivity. The media narrative writes itself." Sarah Martinez intercepted the team at the main entrance, her security training immediately recognizing that these men were not legitimate inspectors. Their equipment was wrong, their questions too specific about emergency protocols, and their interest in the large predator enclosures raised every red flag in her experience. "I'm sorry, gentlemen, but I'll need to verify your credentials before you can proceed," she said firmly, positioning herself between Blackwood's team and the main walkway. Marcus Blackwood stepped forward, his smile predatory and cold. "Ms. Martinez, I presume? I'm Marcus Blackwood, CEO of Blackstone Industries. We're conducting a routine safety assessment as part of our environmental impact study for the region." "Environmental impact study for what purpose?" "Future development projects that will benefit the entire community," Marcus replied smoothly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a schedule to maintain." Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward her radio. "I'm afraid I can't allow that without proper authorization from Dr. Stone. Sanctuary policy requires advance notification for any inspections." The tension was building throughout the facility, though most visitors remained unaware of the underlying drama. Children laughed at the antics of playful otters, families took selfies with peacocks roaming the grounds, and elderly couples walked slowly along the winding paths, enjoying what might be one of their last warm afternoons of the year. Bill Thompson continued his conversation with Buddy, unaware that his every word was being recorded by hidden microphones that Marcus Blackwood had installed weeks earlier. The plan required documentation of the dangerous animal's aggressive behavior, though Buddy's gentle response to Bill's presence contradicted everything Blackwood needed for his narrative. "You know, boy, I've been thinking about Martha a lot lately," Bill said, his voice weak but steady. "She always wanted children, but after the miscarriage, the doctors said it wouldn't happen. Then Rebecca came along through the adoption agency, but something went wrong with the paperwork, and we never got to bring her home." Broke Martha's heart, losing that little girl. Buddy pressed his massive head against the fence, his dark eyes focused intently on Bill's face as if he understood every word. The bear's unusual stillness had attracted the attention of several visitors, who began taking photos and videos of the extraordinary interaction between the elderly man and the massive predator. At 3:30 p.m., Rebecca finally made her decision. She walked quickly toward Buddy's enclosure, the adoption papers clutched in her trembling hand, determined to tell Bill the truth before whatever crisis she sensed was approaching could unfold. But as she rounded the corner near the main pavilion, she saw Marcus Blackwood's team spreading out across the grounds, and her heart began racing with terrible certainty. "Sarah," she spoke urgently into her radio, "initiate Code Yellow immediately. We have unauthorized individuals on the property, and I believe they're planning to sabotage the animal enclosures." But it was already too late. At exactly 3:45 p.m., Tommy Rodriguez activated the device that disabled the electronic locks throughout the large predator section of the sanctuary. His finger hesitated for a moment over the button, his mind filled with images of Isabella's pale face and trusting smile, before pressing down with the weight of a father's desperate love. The effect was immediate. Electronic locks that had secured the enclosures for 8 years suddenly clicked open, their fail-safes overridden by the sophisticated hacking device. Emergency lights began flashing throughout the maintenance control room, and alarms started blaring across the sanctuary grounds. Buddy was the first to notice the change. His restless pacing had brought him near the enclosure gate when the locks disengaged, and his extraordinary intelligence immediately recognized the opportunity. But instead of randomly escaping into the sanctuary grounds, the massive bear moved with deliberate purpose toward the one person who had shown him unconditional love for the past 3 months. The first visitor to spot Buddy outside his enclosure was Maria Santos, a teacher from the Billings Elementary School field trip. Her scream pierced the autumn air like a fire alarm, instantly triggering panic throughout the sanctuary. "Bear! There's a bear loose!" Chaos erupted immediately. Parents scooped up children and ran toward the parking lot. Elderly visitors struggled to move quickly enough to reach safety, and teenagers pulled out their phones to record what they assumed would be a tragic wildlife attack. The peaceful family atmosphere transformed into a scene from a disaster movie within seconds. Sarah Martinez's training kicked in as she coordinated the emergency response, her voice cutting through the panic over the sanctuary's PA system. "This is not a drill. All visitors proceed immediately to the parking lot and remain in your vehicles. Staff implement Code Red protocols immediately." But Buddy ignored the fleeing crowds, the shouting voices, and the emergency sirens. His massive frame moved steadily along the main walkway, following a path he had memorized from months of watching Bill's daily visits. Other animals in nearby enclosures became agitated by the commotion, adding to the cacophony of sounds that filled the Montana air. Bill Thompson heard the screams and sirens, but his failing health prevented him from understanding what was happening until he saw familiar visitors running past his position near the picnic area. When he spotted the unmistakable shape of Buddy approaching through the scattered crowd, his heart began racing not with fear, but with a complex mixture of joy and concern. "Oh, my boy," he whispered, reaching out one trembling hand as the 800-pound bear approached his wheelchair. "What have you done? What have they made you do?" The moment that would be recorded on dozens of cell phones and broadcast around the world was about to unfold. But none of the witnesses understood they were about to witness not an attack, but a reunion between two souls who had found in each other the family they had always been searching for. The massive bear stopped 10 feet from Bill Thompson's wheelchair, and in that moment the chaos of the sanctuary seemed to pause as if the world itself was holding its breath. Buddy's enormous frame blocked out the afternoon sun, casting a shadow over the elderly man who had become the center of his universe. But instead of the aggressive posture that everyone expected from an escaped predator, Buddy lowered his massive head and made a sound that none of the terrified onlookers had ever heard before, a low, rumbling vocalization that sounded almost like a conversation. Bill Thompson slowly removed his oxygen mask despite his labored breathing, his weathered face breaking into a smile that seemed to illuminate the growing darkness around them. "I know, son," he said softly, his voice barely audible above the distant sirens but somehow reaching the bear with perfect clarity. "I missed you too." The crowd of fleeing visitors had mostly dispersed, but several dozen people remained at what they considered a safe distance, their cell phones capturing every moment of what appeared to be an impossible interaction between a wild predator and a defenseless elderly man. Sarah Martinez crouched behind a maintenance shed 50 yards away, her tranquilizer rifle trained on Buddy, her finger hovering over the trigger as she tried to understand what she was witnessing. "Command, this is Martinez," she spoke urgently into her radio. "The bear has approached Thompson, but it's not showing aggressive behavior. Repeat, no aggressive displays. The animal appears calm, but I have a clear shot if needed." Dr. Rebecca Stone's voice crackled back through the radio, filled with an emotion that Sarah couldn't identify. "Hold your position, Sarah. Do not fire unless there's an immediate threat to human life." Something about this situation isn't what it appears to be. Marcus Blackwood stood near the main pavilion with his team of 6 men, watching the scene unfold through high-powered binoculars. His carefully orchestrated plan was proceeding exactly as designed, except for one critical detail. The bear wasn't attacking. Instead of the brutal mauling that would justify his development project and satisfy his decades-old vendetta, he was watching what looked like a reunion between old friends. "Sir," one of his men spoke quietly into his earpiece, "the target isn't behaving as expected. Should we proceed with the contingency plan?" Marcus's jaw tightened as he watched Buddy gently nuzzle Bill's outstretched hand. "Give it another minute. If the animal doesn't attack naturally, we'll force the situation." Buddy approached Bill's wheelchair with the careful deliberation of someone visiting a beloved but fragile relative. His massive paws, each the size of dinner plates, stepped delicately around the scattered picnic items that fleeing visitors had abandoned. When he reached the wheelchair, the 800-pound bear performed an action that would be replayed millions of times on social media. He gently placed his enormous head in Bill's lap, assuming the exact position he had taken during their daily visits at the enclosure fence. "There's my boy," Bill whispered, his trembling hands stroking Buddy's thick fur with the tenderness of a father comforting a frightened child. "You came looking for your old dad, didn't you? You always were too smart for your own good." The intimate moment was being broadcast live on multiple social media platforms as visitors live-streamed the encounter, their initial terror transforming into awe as they witnessed something that challenged everything they thought they knew about wild animals. Comments poured in from viewers around the world, creating hashtags like #BuddyandBill and #BearReunion that began trending globally within minutes. Dr. Rebecca Stone pushed through the scattered crowd, her medical training overriding her fear as she approached the scene. She had spent 2 years watching Bill form this extraordinary bond with Buddy, but seeing it displayed in such raw, vulnerable terms brought tears to her eyes. More importantly, as she drew closer, she could see that Bill's physical condition was deteriorating rapidly under the stress of the situation. "Bill?" she called softly, not wanting to startle Buddy, but needing to assess the medical emergency she could see developing. "Bill, are you all right?" Bill looked up at Rebecca with eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of gratitude. "Dr. Stone, I need you to promise me something. If this old heart finally gives out, don't let them hurt my boy. He's not dangerous. He's just scared and confused without his family." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow, and she felt the weight of the secret she had carried for 2 years pressing down on her chest. Here was her father, potentially dying in front of her, and she still hadn't found the courage to tell him who she really was. But before she could respond, the situation took a dramatic turn. Marcus Blackwood had seen enough. His plan required a tragedy, not a heartwarming reunion that would generate sympathy for the sanctuary and make development impossible. He signaled to his team, and 2 men began moving toward Bill and Buddy from different directions, carrying devices designed to emit high-frequency sounds that would agitate the bear and trigger an aggressive response. "Sir, are you sure about this?" one of his men asked through the earpiece. "There are witnesses everywhere, and most of them are recording." "Execute the plan," Marcus replied coldly. "We'll deal with the witnesses after the fact. Make it look like the bear was startled by something and attacked instinctively." Sarah Martinez spotted the men moving through her scope and immediately recognized their tactical approach. These weren't sanctuary staff or emergency responders. They were deliberately positioning themselves to interfere with the situation. Her years of military experience before joining the sanctuary had trained her to recognize hostile intent, and everything about these men's movements screamed danger. "Command, "We have unknown individuals approaching the scene," she radioed to Rebecca. "They're not part of our emergency response team, and their approach pattern suggests hostile intent." Rebecca's blood ran cold as she realized that the safety inspection team had been planning this moment all along. "Sarah, can you identify who's commanding them?" "Affirmative." "It's the man who claimed to be a state inspector, the one with the expensive suit and cold eyes." As the first of Marcus's men activated his sonic device, Buddy's head snapped up from Bill's lap, his ears flattening against his skull as the painful high-frequency sound assaulted his sensitive hearing. The bear's entire demeanor changed instantly, confusion and pain replacing the gentle affection he had been displaying moments before. Bill felt Buddy's muscles tense beneath his hands and immediately understood that something was wrong. "Easy, boy," he said firmly, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he had once used to calm spooked horses. "Whatever's happening, we'll face it together." But Buddy was becoming increasingly agitated as the second device joined the first, creating a cacophony of sound that only he could hear. The bear began to pace in tight circles around Bill's wheelchair, his vocalizations changing from gentle rumbles to distressed whines that carried across the sanctuary grounds. The visitors who had remained to witness the reunion began backing away again, their phones still recording, but their expressions shifting from wonder back to fear. The sonic devices were having their intended effect, transforming a peaceful interaction into what appeared to be an increasingly dangerous situation. "Now," Marcus spoke into his radio, "activate Phase 2. The third device was more sophisticated than the first two, a high-powered sound cannon that had been positioned on the roof of the main pavilion. When it activated, the invisible beam of sonic energy struck Buddy like a physical blow, causing him to rear up on his hind legs and emit a roar of pain and confusion that echoed across the Montana landscape. Standing at his full height of nearly 9 feet, Buddy appeared to be exactly what Marcus Blackwood needed, a dangerous predator threatening an innocent elderly man. The cameras captured every second as the massive bear towered over Bill's wheelchair, his powerful arms spread wide in what looked like an aggressive display but was actually an attempt to locate the source of his torment. Sarah Martinez had seen enough. "I don't care about protocol," she muttered, switching her radio to the emergency frequency used by local law enforcement. "This is Montana Wildlife Sanctuary requesting immediate assistance. We have multiple suspects attempting to interfere with an emergency situation involving civilians." But even as she called for backup, Sarah knew that help wouldn't arrive in time to prevent whatever Marcus Blackwood was planning. The sonic devices continued their assault on Buddy's hearing, and the bear's distress was becoming more pronounced with each passing second. Bill Thompson looked up at the massive creature who had become his surrogate son and made a decision that would define both their destinies. Despite his failing health, despite the oxygen tank that barely kept him breathing, despite the wheelchair that had robbed him of mobility, he reached up and placed both hands on Buddy's massive chest. "Look at me, son," he said with all the authority his voice could muster. "Look at Daddy. Whatever they're doing to you, whatever's making you hurt, remember who you are. Remember who loves you. Remember that you're safe with me." The moment stretched like a taut wire between chaos and peace, between Marcus Blackwood's carefully orchestrated tragedy and the simple power of unconditional love. Around the world, millions of viewers held their breath as they watched an elderly man in a wheelchair face down an 800-pound bear with nothing more than gentle words and steady hands. What happened next would challenge everything the scientific community thought they knew about animal intelligence, emotional memory, and the bonds that transcend species barriers. The high-frequency sonic devices reached their peak intensity just as Bill Thompson's heart began to fail. The combination of emotional stress, physical exertion, and his terminal condition created a perfect storm of medical crisis that no amount of willpower could overcome. His weathered hands, still resting on Buddy's massive chest, began to tremble violently as crushing pain radiated from his heart down his left arm. "Easy, boy," Bill whispered, his voice growing weaker with each word as his heart struggled against the failing rhythm. "Daddy's here. Daddy's not going anywhere." But even as he spoke the words, Bill Thompson knew they weren't true. The pain in his chest was unlike anything he had experienced before, a crushing weight that made each breath feel like his last. His vision began to blur around the edges, and the sounds of the sanctuary, the emergency sirens, the distant shouting, the whine of the sonic devices, seemed to fade into a hollow echo. Buddy sensed the change immediately. The bear's extraordinary intelligence, honed by 8 years of reading human emotions and behaviors, recognized the subtle shifts in Bill's scent. The change in his breathing pattern, the way his hands grew still against the bear's fur. Despite the torment of the sonic assault, Buddy's attention focused entirely on the man who had become his world. The massive bear lowered himself to all fours and gently nuzzled Bill's face, his warm breath fogging the lenses of the old man's glasses. Buddy made a sound that observers would later describe as heartbreaking, a low, mournful vocalization that seemed to carry all the grief of every creature who had ever lost someone they loved. "My boy," Bill gasped, his hand reaching up to touch Buddy's snout one last time. "My sweet boy. You remember Daddy loves you, okay? No matter what happens next, you remember that someone in this world thought you were perfect just the way you are. Doctor." Rebecca Stone had been monitoring the situation from 50 yards away, but the moment she saw Bill's collapse, her medical training overrode every other consideration. She ran toward the scene, her emergency medical kit bouncing against her hip as she covered the distance in record time. The fact that she was approaching an agitated 800-pound bear without any protective equipment seemed irrelevant compared to the possibility of losing her father before she could tell him the truth. "Bill!" she shouted, dropping to her knees beside his wheelchair and immediately checking his pulse. The irregular, thready heartbeat confirmed her worst fears. He was experiencing a massive cardiac event that could kill him within minutes. "I need an ambulance at the main pavilion immediately. Patient is a 72-year-old male in acute cardiac distress." Buddy's reaction to Rebecca's arrival was unprecedented. Instead of the territorial aggression that most wild animals would display when a stranger approached their family member, the bear seemed to understand that she was trying to help. He positioned himself protectively around both humans, creating a living barrier between them and the chaos that continued to unfold around the sanctuary. Marcus Blackwood watched the scene through his binoculars with growing fury. His carefully orchestrated plan was falling apart before his eyes. Instead of a vicious attack that would justify closing the sanctuary, he was witnessing what appeared to be a bear protecting an elderly man and a veterinarian. The optics couldn't have been worse for his development project. "Shut off the sonic devices," he barked into his radio. "We're switching to Plan B." "What's Plan B, sir?" one of his men responded. "Direct intervention. Make it look like we're trying to save the old man from a dangerous animal. Use the tranquilizer rifles, but aim for the heart. Make sure the bear doesn't survive the rescue attempt." Sarah Martinez had been monitoring Marcus's team through her scope, and her military training allowed her to read their tactical movements. When she saw 2 men raising high-powered rifles in Buddy's direction, she made a decision that would end her career at the sanctuary, but potentially save 3 lives. "Federal officers, drop your weapons!" she shouted, knowing that no actual federal agents were present but hoping to create enough confusion to disrupt Marcus's plan. "This is a federal wildlife protection area, and you are interfering with an emergency medical situation." The bluff worked just long enough for Rebecca to begin emergency treatment on Bill. She injected him with nitroglycerin from her kit, hoping to stabilize his heart rhythm while they waited for the ambulance. But even as she worked to save his life, she struggled with the knowledge that these might be his final moments, and she still hadn't told him who she really was. Tommy Rodriguez watched the unfolding tragedy from the maintenance building, the weight of his betrayal crushing down on him like a physical force. His sabotage of the enclosure locks had created this situation. But seeing Bill's collapse and Buddy's obvious distress made him realize the true cost of Marcus Blackwood's money. No amount of financial compensation could justify what was happening to these innocent beings who had found love in an unlikely friendship. "I have to stop this," he muttered, grabbing the master reset control that would reactivate all the electronic systems and hopefully end the sonic assault that was still tormenting Buddy. But as Tommy reached for the controls, Marcus Blackwood appeared in the doorway behind him, flanked by two of his men. "Step away from the equipment, Rodriguez. You've done your job, now let us finish ours. Those devices are killing that bear," Tommy protested, his voice shaking with guilt and rage. "And that old man is dying because of what I did. I won't let you make this worse." Marcus pulled out a pistol and aimed it at Tommy's chest. "Your daughter needs that money, remember? Isabella is counting on you to make the right choice here. Don't let her down by developing a conscience at the last minute." The mention of his daughter's name froze Tommy in place, but it also crystallized his understanding of what kind of man Marcus Blackwood really was. Anyone who would use a dying child as leverage for murder was capable of anything, including ensuring that Tommy never lived to testify about the conspiracy. Back at the scene of Bill's medical crisis, Buddy had begun exhibiting behavior that would later be studied by animal psychologists around the world. The massive bear was gently licking Bill's forehead while making soft vocalizations that sounded remarkably like a human trying to comfort a loved one. When Rebecca needed to position her stethoscope on Bill's chest, Buddy carefully moved aside but remained close enough to maintain physical contact. "It's okay, big guy," Rebecca whispered to the bear while monitoring Bill's vital signs. "We're going to take care of him. I promise we won't let anything bad happen to your dad." The word "dad" seemed to resonate with both Buddy and the semi-conscious Bill, who managed to open his eyes and look directly at Rebecca. For a moment, his vision cleared enough to study her face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had haunted him for decades. "Rebecca?" he whispered, his voice so weak that she had to lean close to hear him. "My little Rebecca, is that really you?" The question hit her like a lightning bolt. Somehow, despite his medical crisis and the chaos surrounding them, Bill had recognized something in her face, her voice, or her mannerisms that connected her to the daughter he and Martha had lost 47 years ago. The adoption papers in her pocket seemed to burn against her chest as she struggled with how to respond. "Dad," she whispered back, tears streaming down her face as she held his hand while continuing to monitor his heart rhythm. "Yes, Dad. It's me. I found you. I've been looking for you my whole life." Bill's eyes filled with tears as he squeezed her hand with what little strength remained in his failing body. "Martha always said you'd come home someday. She never gave up hope, even when I started to doubt." The reunion between father and daughter was interrupted by the distant sound of sirens as the first ambulance finally approached the sanctuary. But even as help arrived, the larger crisis continued to unfold around them. Marcus Blackwood's men were repositioning for another assault on Buddy, and the bear's distress was becoming more pronounced as the sonic devices maintained their invisible torture. "We need to move him to safety," Rebecca told the approaching paramedics, but even as she spoke, she knew that separating Bill from Buddy might be impossible. The bond between them had become so strong that traumatic separation could prove fatal to both. The next few minutes would determine whether love could triumph over greed, whether family bonds could overcome corporate conspiracy, and whether an unlikely friendship between species could survive the worst that humanity had to offer. The sound of sirens grew louder as the first ambulance navigated through the panicked crowd in the sanctuary parking lot. But the paramedics faced an unprecedented challenge. Their patient was being protected by an 800-pound bear who refused to allow strangers near the man he considered family. Buddy had positioned himself over Bill's wheelchair like a living shield, his massive frame creating an impenetrable barrier between the dying man and anyone who approached. "Sir, we need you to move back so we can treat the patient," paramedic Janet Morrison called out, her voice steady despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. She had 23 years of emergency medical experience, but nothing had prepared her for negotiating with a wild animal to save a human life. Rebecca Stone stood slowly, her hands still trembling from the shock of finally revealing her identity to the father she had searched for her entire life. "Buddy," she said softly, using the gentle tone she had learned from watching Bill's interactions with the bear. "We're trying to help him. We want to save your dad just like you do." The massive bear turned his dark eyes toward Rebecca, studying her with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Something in her voice or manner must have reassured him, because Buddy carefully stepped aside, though he remained close enough to intervene if he sensed any threat to Bill's safety. As the paramedics began their life-saving work, connecting IV lines and oxygen equipment to Bill's failing body, a more sinister drama was unfolding in the maintenance building. Tommy Rodriguez faced the barrel of Marcus Blackwood's pistol while struggling with the most important decision of his life. His daughter, Isabella, needed the money for her cancer treatment, but his conscience couldn't bear the weight of what his sabotage had set in motion. "Your choice is simple, Rodriguez," Marcus said coldly. "Walk away and let us finish what we started, and your daughter gets her treatment. Interfere and you'll be in no position to help anyone." But Tommy was no longer listening to Marcus's threats. Through the maintenance building's window, he could see Buddy gently nuzzling Bill's unconscious face while the paramedics worked to stabilize his condition. The bear's obvious love for the dying man had transformed Tommy's understanding of what he had helped to destroy. "My daughter wouldn't want to live knowing her life was bought with an innocent creature's death," Tommy said quietly, then lunged for the emergency override switch that would shut down all the sonic devices simultaneously. The gunshot that followed echoed across the sanctuary grounds, causing Buddy to roar in alarm and the paramedics to freeze in their life-saving work. Marcus Blackwood had pulled the trigger, but Tommy's desperate dive toward the controls had saved his life. The bullet shattered the equipment panel instead of finding its human target. Sparks flew from the destroyed control system as every electronic device in the sanctuary shut down simultaneously. The sonic torture that had been driving Buddy to the edge of madness finally ended, and the sudden silence felt like a blessing from heaven. The bear's agitation immediately decreased, though his protective instincts remained focused on Bill's motionless form. Sarah Martinez had been watching the maintenance building through her rifle scope when she saw the muzzle flash from Marcus's weapon. Her military training took over as she radioed for law enforcement backup while maintaining her position overlooking the medical emergency. "Shots fired in the maintenance building," she broadcast on all frequencies. "Multiple suspects armed and dangerous. Officer needs assistance." The destruction of the control panel had an unexpected consequence. Security cameras throughout the sanctuary began broadcasting their feeds directly to social media platforms as backup systems activated. Millions of viewers around the world suddenly had multiple camera angles of the unfolding drama, including crystal-clear footage of Marcus Blackwood holding a smoking gun over Tommy Rodriguez's prone form. Within minutes, #Save Buddy and Bill was trending globally as social media users shared the live streams with friends and family. The hashtag reached 20 million views in the first hour, drawing attention from animal rights organizations, news networks, and celebrities who began sharing the story with their massive followings. Dr. Jane Goodall tweeted, "Watching this extraordinary bond between a bear and his human father challenges everything we think we know about animal emotions. This is love in its purest form." Leonardo DiCaprio shared the stream with his 40 million followers, writing, "Corporate greed destroying the natural bonds between species. This is why we fight for wildlife protection." The viral attention brought unexpected help. A helicopter carrying FBI agents who had been investigating Blackstone Industries' pattern of sanctuary acquisitions was diverted to the Montana facility. Agent Maria Santos had been building a case against Marcus Blackwood for months, and the live-streamed evidence of his criminal conspiracy was exactly what she needed to make arrests. Meanwhile, Bill Thompson's condition had stabilized enough for transport, but the paramedics faced another unprecedented challenge. Every time they attempted to move his wheelchair toward the ambulance, Buddy became agitated and blocked their path. The bear seemed to understand that the strange humans were trying to take his family away, and his protective instincts wouldn't allow separation. "We can't sedate the bear. It could take 20 minutes to take effect, and the patient might not survive that long," Janet Morrison told Rebecca. "Is there any way to convince the animal that we're trying to help?" Rebecca knelt beside Buddy's massive head, her veterinary training helping her recognize the signs of extreme stress in the bear's behavior. Despite the end of the sonic assault, Buddy was still processing the trauma of the past hour, and his trust in human beings had been shattered by everything except his bond with Bill. "Buddy, listen to me," she said softly, placing her hand on his snout the way she had seen Bill do countless times. "Dad needs to go to the hospital to get better, but I promise you, I swear to you, that he'll come back." "We'll bring him back to you." The bear studied her face intently, and Rebecca felt the strange sensation that she was being evaluated by an intelligence far more sophisticated than most humans gave animals credit for possessing. After several long moments, Buddy stepped aside and allowed the paramedics to wheel Bill toward the ambulance. But as they loaded the unconscious man into the emergency vehicle, Buddy began following the stretcher with obvious intention to climb aboard. The ambulance wasn't designed to transport an 800-pound bear, and the paramedics faced the impossible task of explaining medical logistics to a grieving animal. "Wait," Rebecca said suddenly, struck by inspiration. "What if we transport them together in one of the sanctuary's large animal trailers? I can provide medical support during transport, and Buddy can stay with Bill." It was an unprecedented solution that violated numerous protocols, but Janet Morrison had seen enough unusual situations to recognize when flexibility might save a life. "If you're qualified to provide emergency medical support and take full responsibility, I'll approve the alternative transport method." The FBI helicopter touched down in the sanctuary parking lot just as Marcus Blackwood's team attempted to escape through the service roads. Agent Santos and her team had been monitoring the live streams and arrived with warrants for conspiracy, attempted murder, and violation of federal wildlife protection laws. Marcus Blackwood's 47-year quest for revenge against the bear species that had killed his father ended with handcuffs and federal charges that would likely result in a life sentence. The sonic devices his team had used to torture Buddy were illegal under federal animal cruelty statutes, and the live-streamed evidence made conviction virtually certain. Tommy Rodriguez was discovered wounded but alive in the maintenance building, his heroic attempt to save Buddy and Bill earning him immunity from prosecution in exchange for his testimony against Blackwood. The money he had been promised for his daughter's treatment was replaced by donations from the millions of people who had watched the drama unfold online. Within 6 hours of the first emergency sirens, the Save Buddy and Bill GoFundMe campaign had raised over $2 million for Isabella Rodriguez's cancer treatment, Bill Thompson's medical care, and the sanctuary's ongoing operations. The viral video had touched something deep in the human psyche, a recognition that love transcends species barriers and that some bonds are worth fighting to protect. The specially equipped animal transport trailer arrived at Billings General Hospital accompanied by police escorts and news crews from around the world. Hospital administrators had initially refused to allow a bear on the premises, but public pressure and the unique medical circumstances forced them to make unprecedented accommodations. Dr. Sarah Chen, the hospital's chief cardiologist, had been monitoring Bill's condition during transport and was amazed by the stability his vital signs showed whenever Buddy was nearby. "I've never seen anything like it," she told reporters. "The patient's stress levels decrease dramatically when the bear is in physical contact. It's as if the animal's presence has actual therapeutic value." As Bill Thompson was wheeled into the cardiac intensive care unit with Buddy walking carefully beside the gurney, millions of viewers around the world watched a love story that had redefined their understanding of family, loyalty, and the mysterious connections that bind all living creatures together. The next phase of their journey would test whether modern medicine could save a man's life while honoring the bond that had already saved his soul. 3 weeks after the dramatic events at Montana Wildlife Sanctuary, Bill Thompson opened his eyes in the cardiac intensive care unit at Billings General Hospital to find Buddy's massive head resting gently on the bed beside him. The experimental heart surgery had been successful beyond all medical expectations, funded by the overwhelming public response to their story. Dr. Sarah Chen had initially given him a 30% chance of survival, but the presence of his 800-pound companion seemed to provide a healing power that medical science couldn't explain. "Hello, my boy," Bill whispered, his voice still weak but filled with the warmth that had first drawn Buddy to him months ago. "Did you stay here the whole time?" "You didn't have to do that, son." Buddy lifted his head and made that soft rumbling sound that had become their private language, a vocalization that nurses throughout the hospital had learned to recognize as contentment rather than aggression. The bear had maintained a vigil beside Bill's bed for 22 days, refusing to eat unless Rebecca personally brought his meals, and declining to leave even when hospital administrators initially tried to relocate him to a temporary enclosure in the parking lot. Rebecca Stone sat in the visitor's chair she had occupied almost continuously since her father's surgery, her eyes red with tears of relief as she watched him slowly return to consciousness. The 3 weeks had allowed them to have the conversations that 47 years of separation had made impossible. Stories about Martha's flower gardens, explanations about the adoption that had gone wrong, and shared memories of a family that had always been meant to be together. "Dad," she said softly, taking his hand in both of hers, "the doctors say you're going to make a full recovery. The surgery repaired the damage to your heart, and your vital signs have been stronger than they've been in years." Bill squeezed his daughter's hand with surprising strength, then reached his other hand toward Buddy, who immediately nuzzled his palm with gentle affection. "I've got my family back," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Both my children right here where I can see them." The room was filled with flowers, cards, and gifts from around the world. Children from every continent had sent drawings of bears and elderly men holding hands. The Montana governor had issued a proclamation declaring Bill and Buddy state treasures, and the president had called personally to commend their story as an example of the love that makes America great. Jake Thompson stood in the doorway, still struggling to process the transformation in his father and the revelation of a sister he had never known existed. The successful businessman from Seattle had watched the viral videos with the rest of the world, but seeing his father's genuine happiness with Rebecca and Buddy had forced him to confront his own failures as a son. "Dad," Jake said quietly, stepping into the room with the hesitant manner of someone seeking forgiveness, "I've been watching you with Rebecca and Buddy, and I realize I never gave you the chance to be the father to me that you've been to them." Bill's eyes filled with tears as he looked at his son. His biological son, who had grown up angry and distant, convinced that his father cared more about work than family. "Jake, come here, boy. We've got a lot of years to make up for, but we've got time now. The doctors say I might have another 10 years if I take care of myself." The reunion between father and son was interrupted by Sarah Martinez, who knocked softly on the hospital room door. The former head of security had become something of a celebrity herself after her role in exposing Marcus Blackwood's conspiracy, and she carried news that would affect all of their futures. "Bill, I wanted to let you know that the federal investigation is complete," Sarah said, her voice carrying satisfaction that justice had been served. "Marcus Blackwood has been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for conspiracy, attempted murder, and violations of the Endangered Species Act. His company has been dissolved and all assets have been seized." She continued with even better news. "The court has ordered that Blackstone Industries' seized assets be used to create a trust fund for wildlife protection. The Montana Wildlife Sanctuary will receive permanent funding, and there are plans to establish the Bill and Buddy Foundation for research into human-animal bonds." Tommy Rodriguez appeared behind Sarah, walking with a slight limp from his gunshot wound, but smiling broadly. His daughter Isabella had completed her cancer treatment successfully, funded entirely by donations from people inspired by the story of love and sacrifice. "Bill, I wanted to thank you again for what you did. Isabella is in complete remission, and the doctors say her prognosis is excellent." "You don't need to thank me, son," Bill replied, his voice gaining strength with each conversation. "You stood up when it counted. That took more courage than anything I did." Dr. Jane Goodall entered the room with a small entourage of researchers and documentary filmmakers, her presence lending scientific credibility to what many still considered an impossible story. At 90 years old, the world's most famous primatologist had requested to meet Bill and Buddy personally to study their bond for potential inclusion in her ongoing research. "Mr. Thompson," Dr. Goodall said in her distinctive British accent, "I've spent 70 years studying the emotional intelligence of animals, and I must say that what you and Buddy have demonstrated challenges some of our most fundamental assumptions about interspecies relationships." She explained that preliminary research into their bond had revealed neurological patterns in Buddy's brain that were remarkably similar to those found in humans experiencing deep familial love. "The scientific community is beginning to understand that emotional bonds between species may be far more common and profound than we ever imagined." The documentary crew that had been filming their story revealed that Buddy and Bill, A Love Beyond Species, would premiere simultaneously in theaters and on streaming platforms worldwide, with all proceeds going to wildlife conservation efforts. The film had already generated advance interest from the Academy Awards Committee and was being called the most important nature documentary since March of the Penguins. But the most significant development came when the hospital's chief administrator announced that Billings General was creating a new therapeutic program based on Bill and Buddy's relationship. "Animal-assisted therapy isn't new, Doctor," Margaret Foster explained, "but the depth of healing we've witnessed here has inspired us to develop the first hospital program specifically designed around human-animal family bonds." Rebecca had been offered positions at veterinary schools and research institutions around the world, but her decision was never in doubt. "I spent 47 years looking for my family," she told the assembled group. "I'm not leaving them again. The sanctuary will be my permanent home, and I'll be conducting my research right here in Montana." Jake had made his own life-changing decision, selling his Seattle consulting business to move back to Montana and help manage the family's new foundation. "I missed too many years trying to prove I didn't need my father," he admitted to the documentary cameras. Turns out what I really needed was to learn how to love unconditionally, the way Buddy loves Dad. As the sun set over the Montana mountains, visible through the hospital room's large windows, Bill Thompson looked around at the family he had never imagined possible. His daughter had found her way home after decades of separation. His son had rediscovered the love that work and resentment had obscured. And his 800-pound bear son had taught them all what it meant to love without conditions or expectations. "You know what the funny thing is?" Bill said to the room full of family and friends. "I spent my whole life working on railroads, connecting places that were far apart. Turns out the most important connection I ever made was with a scared bear cub who just needed someone to see him as more than a wild animal." Buddy made his soft rumbling sound of contentment, his massive head still resting on the hospital bed, his dark eyes reflecting a peace that seemed to encompass everyone in the room. Outside, the first stars appeared in the Montana sky, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the landscape, a sound that once symbolized departure, but now represented the journey home. The story of Bill Thompson and Buddy had ended where all the best love stories do, not with dramatic gestures or grand declarations, but with the quiet certainty that some bonds transcend every barrier that life can create, and that family isn't defined by blood or species, but by the simple decision to never give up on each other. Sometimes the greatest love stories don't unfold the way we expect them to. When 72-year-old Bill Thompson found himself alone in a trailer park, living on $847 a month and choosing between heart medication and groceries, he thought his story was ending. His son Jake had moved away, calling twice a year if he was lucky. His beloved wife Martha had passed, taking with her the dreams of the daughter they'd lost through a failed adoption 47 years earlier. But love has a way of finding us when we least expect it, in forms we never imagined. For Bill, it came in the shape of Buddy, an 800-pound bear who had also been abandoned and forgotten. Their bond proved that family isn't defined by blood or species, but by the simple decision to show up for each other, day after day, with unconditional love. At an age when society often makes us feel invisible, Bill discovered that the connections we make, whether with our children, grandchildren, or even the strays we feed behind our trailers, can rewrite our entire story. Sometimes the family we're searching for has been waiting for us all along, and it's never too late to come home. What unexpected friendships have brought joy to your later years? Have you ever discovered that love can appear in the most surprising forms?